Greetings, class. So let's take a moment here to look over the Thursday/Friday lecture from the posting that I made in our graphic novels comic book class blog, Understanding Comics, Understanding McCloud. So in this point, one of the reasons why I'm doing this, we're starting out with McCloud, is that I want to provide you guys with a base of knowledge and information that can benefit you and help you navigate these if it's something that's unfamiliar to you as a genre, or you maybe have little exposure to it. And I want to start here by looking at the primary reason. That's one of my primary reasons for giving this to you. And so you'll notice here that in a lot of my postings, I use this avatar version of myself. And in this one, I'm including not only my own little pop-up head version of myself, but I've included McCloud. And so I'm going to start here by looking at McCloud's definition for what he says comics are. And he says comics are juxtaposed pictorial and other images in a deliberate sequence intended to convey information and/or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. Now, of course, for you guys, that may be kind of over your head. That's over the heads of a lot of people. And I put in here, what does that mean? And you can see my little head where I'm thinking and little question marks. And then I elaborate on this by sort of adding to it my own definition, or an expanding, you might say, upon McCloud's definition, or rewording it. Well, for me, and to put it to you like this means that we are, when we read comics and graphic novels, following a visual story, sometimes and sometimes not combined with words, that is laid out in individual frames, panels, that are placed in a deliberate, intentional sequence designed to elicit a distinct understanding or response from an audience who views it. And let me elaborate on this even more by giving you this idea that what we're really dealing with in the most simplified form is we are dealing with, in comic books and graphic novels, we are dealing with the fact that, that artists and writers have deliberately sequenced images to convey a story, or to tell a story, or to get to, shall we say, convey a message, if you want to take it to its simplest form. And one of the things I want to do to sort of really help kick us off is look at this PowerPoint I have posted here at the bottom concerning McCloud's chapters 1 through 3. And I think this will really help us sort of get to a deeper understanding, or at least begin to have a deeper understanding of what we're going to be dealing with. So here's McCloud again. This is from here's the full title of his work. And he says, Understanding Comics is a Serious Business. And so we're going to go with chapter 1, Setting the Record Straight. Now, of course, early on in this, he provides a definition, and this is the definition we just looked at. And he even admits here that this is the sort of thing that comes up a lot in casual. It's not something that comes up in casual conversation. And if you look at the actual text, he does this by sort of playing a game of trying to figure out the definition. But ultimately, what he's getting at here is that he feels that comics represent a harmonious, at best, coming together of words and images. It's a blending of the two elements. Of course, this ties into what he's saying in his definition and the definition that I gave you as well. So we're left with this idea of what are comics, and this is what McCloud is trying to get at. First of all, he wants us to see comics in a less narrow fashion. And let me elaborate on this with a little bit of a story here. Oftentimes, if you were there in class, I asked you guys, how many of you are familiar with the movie Pulp Fiction by Quentin Tarantino? Some of you indicated that you were familiar with it, and I discussed with you the fact that the name Pulp Fiction is a reference to pulp magazines from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s that were basically cheap detective, horror, all kinds of different little genre stories, and they were printed, and they got their name, pulp novels, by the paper, which was basically paper waste. They were cheap, disposable, almost like newspaper, something that you would expect to read once, twice, 3 times, and then throw away. And comic books sort of share a similar shared history, if you might want to put it. They have a shared history of similarities in that comic books in the early days were seen as something that you would keep for a little while, and then it eventually, the material it was made of would eventually disintegrate. Interestingly enough, that's one of the reasons why old comics such as Action Comics #1, Superman's first appearance, are so rare, because none of them survived. And that's not necessarily a reflection on whether people kept them or not, but just the fact that oftentimes it becomes a matter of the material. Now, when we get back to what McCloud is talking about with this idea of less narrow, well, he really wants this to consider is this idea of not seeing comic books as simply kids stuff. We want to see it as something a little bit more. In a sense, we want to not necessarily consider it to be purely lowbrow or low culture, but that it has the potential to be more high culture. And so he refers to it a lot of times as sequential art. He uses the term sequential to indicate that it's sequenced images placed together in a certain order, and he refers to it as art to sort of qualify it as having that potential to act as something that is of a high cultural value. Now, this isn't to say that all comic books and graphic novels could be considered sequential art or high culture, but they have the potential to be. Now, of course, he then also goes on here to sort of break this down himself, and he talks about the idea that when we take an image individually, it's just a picture. But when we put it together in a sequence, it can become more than that. And so this is from page 5. So if you see the little caption of the picture frame there with the man in the hat in the white section, what you're looking at is just a picture. It's just a man who has his hand on his hat. But if you look at what's in the black bar section, you've got two images, one with the man with his hand in the hat and one of him raising it up. Now we've created a sense of motion and action where he's, tipping his hat or taking his hat off. We've taken a simple picture and we've now added a kind of a sensation of motion, action to it. It goes on with some more examples here. So again, we have the man with the hat. We have also the example of a sun over a body of water. And then when we put it together with in motion, if you'll see on the right, we have the sequence where basically we are creating where it's above and then where it's sinking. We've given the impression of time that it's a sunset. If I were to reverse those two images and have the image with the sun low first and then higher second, I would give you the impression that we were at sunrise in the morning. And then, of course, the next one, we have the picture of the gun, bang, and then a woman shrieking. There's the impression that in that action, someone's been shot. Of course, the next one, we have the sensation of time moving, and then the idea of an eye closing. And we'll come back to that little separation between these two frames in Chapter 3 and discuss how this ties into the gutter space and what happens in that white space in between. But one of the things McCloud stresses is the idea that the definition for comics is an ongoing thing. Go back to where we started this lecture and look at the fact that I started off by talking to you about McCloud's definition, then I gave you a rewording of the definition, and then I tried to give you a simplified version. It's an ongoing one. He says that our attempts to define comics are an ongoing process which won't end anytime soon. So the idea he's wanting to leave you with is that it is an ongoing debate. Now, when we move into Chapter 2, we talk about the vocabulary of comics, and McCloud goes with this idea of naming things icons. And I want to stress here, one of the reasons he chooses this because he wants to stay away from the term symbol. And the reason he stays away from the term symbol is that the term symbol is a loaded concept. He likes to call it a loaded concept or a loaded word. And what he's pointing out there is the fact that when you're dealing with the term with symbols can have a lot of different meaning. If I were to show you an American flag and walk around the room, every one of you could give me a different word or a different meaning connected to that flag. Symbols tend to embody a lot of different meanings, emotions, and thoughts. When he uses the term icon, he's looking for connections that are more allegorical. That means they're more one-to-one. He's any image that's used to represent a person, place, thing, or idea, so it's standing in, rather than having multiple various and ambiguous meanings. And so the realistic to iconic transformation. So you'll see here that we have a picture of a realistic heart. If you look at this, all you're going to think is that maybe this is out of an anatomy book. And then an iconic, I give you the, little heart, almost like an emoticon, emoji kind of thing. Now, if I ask the class what they think when they see that little iconic version, usually most people respond with love. So now all of a sudden that little heart is standing in for love. So if someone sends you that heart a text message, you're getting the idea that, oh, they love you. Whereas if I were to send you that picture of that realistic heart, you'd be like, what? See? Standing in for something. So he calls this idea of cartooning. And cartooning in comics is a form of amplification through simplification. So let me talk about this as a form of amplification through simplification, what he means by that. And I'm going to go back to our little thing here. If I look on the left-hand side and I have the picture of the real heart, and I look on the right-hand side and I have that very simple iconic version. That simple iconic version is a much simpler. It's simple. It's simplified. But its simplification helps it convey a clear, amplified notion of love. You would not get that same concept of love if I sent you a picture of the realistic heart. So by simplifying the idea of the heart, I'm actually having it tap into a much larger concept, in this case, our idea, love. So he talks about this idea of the realistic and iconic some more. He says, when we abstract, and I'm reading from the little panel here, an image through the cartooning, we are not so much eliminating details as we are focusing on specific details. By stripping down an image to its essential meaning, an artist can amplify that meaning in a way that a realistic art can't. And so if you look on the far left-hand side, we have a very detailed picture of a man, shadow, everything. And as we progressively move right, that image is simplified. When we get to the far right-hand side, all we are left with is what appears to be a head, two eyes, and a mouth. Now, though that is simplified, the meaning that we may want to convey is made easier through that simplification. So imagine that simplified face there was two eyes and a frowny face. And imagine that you had a friend send you this emoticon. Your first immediate thought is, oh my gosh, you're sad. Why are you sad? If I were to go backwards all the way shifting to the left and I were to send you a very realistic picture of that man, and I sort of curved his mouth and with a sad face and sent it to you, you'd be like, who is that? So you see what happens there? Rather than get the meaning I'm trying to convey as I'm sad, so I send you a very simple sad face. This is where emoticons and emojis come from. It's what allows us to convey complex ideas. They are simply stripped down, simplified versions that convey very large ideas, emotions, thoughts, and other such things. Okay, so that's that whole principle of amplification through simplification. We simplify so that our message or idea or a person or a place is very clearly represented to our audience. So so he says cartoons and comics have an incredible power to focus our attention on an idea. And McCloud believes that this is an important part of their special power, both in comics and drawing in general. So what's beyond iconic? He gets into this idea of what's called received versus perceived information. And when we look at pictures, okay, a picture typically is a received information. That means that we get information instantaneously. We see it, we understand it immediately, we get a very gut feeling. So if I sent you a sad face emoticon, you would immediately know that obviously I'm sad, all right? If I write it out and tell you why I'm sad, that is perceived information. It has to be decoded. You're going to have to look at it, read it, figure out what I'm trying to tell you. All right? So again, it requires a little bit of interpretation. So on the left-hand side, okay, again here, the received information, we see a face. And then, of course, on the perceived, we see the word face. So there's a barrier, a line here he talks about, okay? But when we deal with comic books, what we're actually dealing with is a coming together of both of these elements, both the received and the perceived. So he talks about reconciling the division, and in the top two panels here, he's talking about the same information we talked about in the same slide, but if we move down to the slide, the panel below that, you'll see that he has a line, and he says here, starting on the left-hand side, when pictures are more abstracted from reality, they require greater levels of perception, more like words. And then moving over to the right, when words are bolder, more direct, they require lower levels of perception that are received faster, more like pictures. So what he's saying here on the far left-hand side of the received information is a very detailed images that are very much like their opposite end there on the perceived. They're complex. We have to read into them. We have to figure out what they're trying to tell us. Okay, then going back to the idea that if I sent that with a slight sad face, you're not going to think I'm sad. You're going to wonder, who is that? And you'd have to explain it. Whereas if I move towards the left, towards that dotted line that he's standing just right there with, that's that line where I'm getting close to the idea of these things being very similar. I've got a simple face and the simple word saying face. And then as I move away back to the other side, you'll see it says 2 eyes, 1 nose, 1 mouth. You go, oh, a face. And obviously I don't even think I can read the cursive on the full version of this. But our need for a unified language of comics sends us towards the center, okay, where words and pictures are like two sides of the same coin, where he's standing in that panel. But our need for sophistication in comics seems to lead us outward, where words and pictures are most separate. Both are worthy aspirations. Both stem from a love of comics and a devotion to its future. And he wants to know, can it be reconciled? So what he's talking about here is the idea that when we deal with comic books, we start at that dotted line running up and down, where the face and the word face are together. That's where we need to be to make sure that these things are interacting with each other. But as we add some greater complications, we are finding ourselves being pulled towards the outside areas. And he's trying to ask, can we reconcile this? And he says yes. And we'll return to this in a later chapter, because he actually does give a reason or a justification for why he thinks there can be a reconciliation. Because it seems that in a sense, we'd be pulling at a rope in opposite directions, playing a game of tug-of-war. Okay, of course, scrolling down here, he then expands this, by the way, into a much larger depiction of imagery and a little bit of a triangle. And here's an interesting thing for you. If I go back to this slide here, if you see the little dotted line where it has the very simple straight face and then the word face and that little perforated line dividing them, if I come over to this next image and I go all the way down to the bottom of the pyramid and scan across, you'll see those two images again, where he's expanded this idea of the separation between the picture plane and the perceived and received information. But don't worry about that. That's just a very wonderful depiction there for us. So now we need to move on to this. Comics give us pictures and words. What do we give comics? And we give our comics, we give them imagination. We fill in the blanks. And this is where we get back to the idea of the space between panels. And this is what's called the gutter. It's the white space between two panels. And I want to start by looking at this image here. Now you see this image. This is a panel. All right. And you see a man with an axe, angry face, and he says, "Now you die." And another man in a face of fear with his hands up screaming, "No, no." Here's another panel. Now we see a cityscape at night and someone screaming in pain. If I were to ask you what you think happened, you're probably going to tell me, well, he must have swung the axe, and that's the man being hit by it. Okay? Now, of course, we don't see that here. That has happened off panel, in a sense. All right? And he goes here on to explain it. He says, see that space in between the panels? That's what comic aficionados name the gutter. And despite its unceremonious title, the gutter plays the host to much of the magic and mystery that are at the heart of comics. I'll give you an example off scene here. When I saw a production of the play A Man for All Seasons, the ending has a scene, or well, you don't actually see it. The end of the play, the protagonist of the story, Sir Thomas More, is executed. He dies. He gets his head cut off. And when I saw it produced at a theater production, they lead him off the stage, and then you hear a sound that sounds like someone getting their head cut off. And you don't see it, but you know what happens, and you know what it sounds like, and you just sort of imagine it, and it's very horrendous sounding. Turns out, and this was revealed to me because one of my friends was in the production, it was actually a watermelon, but it gave such an effective sound. And so your imagination filled in the blank that you didn't see what had happened. And so we're talking a little bit about closure here. The reader uses his or her imagination to figure out what happens in that white space between the panels. So if I go back here, I see the man screaming, "You're going to die, no, no." And you see the scene of the cityscape and someone screaming. We don't see the axe hit the man, but you can imply that. You can imagine that must be what happens. Okay? You use your imagination to do that. Our imagination takes two separate images, like we had in the previous slide, and transform them into a single idea. So in a sense, you take two parts of it and you make the movie in your own mind. There's nothing there in that white space, but our imaginations fill it in, actually. We connect the images and panels to construct a continuous story. Now, there are different types of panel-to-panel transitions, all right? The first type is what's called a moment-to-moment. In this kind of sequence, very little has changed in the panels. We really aren't required to use our imaginations very much to fill in the blank. And now I want to read the PowerPoint for just a second and return to our site and go to our post about how comics work, because I want to show you an example of this. Look at these two scenes here. And I pointed these out in this situation to talk about panels. This first one, we see a door, and then we scope out and we see a door and what looks like a whiteboard or a chalkboard. So very little has happened. We've just simply zoomed out a little bit and we get the impression that it's a classroom. Not a lot of imagination is required in this situation. All right. Now, and you could make an argument that what we looked at previously on the slide here about the idea of this image here, this could be possibly considered a moment-to-moment. The only difference is that we've obviously changed landscapes. So you could make a case that it's moment-to-moment, but you might also make a case that it could be something else entirely as well. Then there is what's called action to action. This change sticks to one subject and one action in progress. I think this one fits more to what's probably going on in that one with the guy with the axe. We see a step-by-step what is happening to one person. We have to use our imaginations in some, but still not very much. It's the most common type of transition. So this one, again, doesn't quite fit that one. You could make a case for it. We also have what's called the subject to subject. We stay with one scene or idea, but we switch different subjects. We go from one person to another. Maybe we're in the same room and we start looking at something in the room from two different perspectives. We have to use our imaginations more now. We still have to fill in what's happening between the two subjects. Second most common type of transition. Then we have a scene to scene. And I honestly think that that scene with the axe and then the cityscape and the screaming where we believe that someone has been probably killed by an axe is kind of a combination of moment to scene, because a great deal of time and space is crossed. We may have crossed a lot of space, or may even just gone out the window. We have to use our imaginations quite a bit to fill in the huge gaps. In that case, we probably have to fill in the fact that he whacked him all the way through, and maybe we turned and looked out the window and could see the city and the guy screams. So it may be a little bit of a moment-to-moment, maybe a little scene-to-scene. Then, of course, we have the aspect-to-aspect. We stay in the same scene, but we see a different aspect of it. The change is what we're looking for within the scene. For example, we may get a close-up on something in the scene. So let me back out again here and show you how I can take a moment-to-moment and turn it into a aspect-to-aspect. If I were to take these two images you see here, this one of the door and this one of the door to the room with the chalkboard, if I were to flip them and you were to start with the door and the chalkboard and then zoom in on the door, that would be when we would move into an aspect-to-aspect change, because I would then be focusing in on the door. And then, of course, there's what's called the non-sequitur. There's no longer logical relationship between the images at all. The panels don't go together. However, we still try to connect them. Our mind wants to make the connections. If I were to return to that idea of the guy with the axe and then the city of the cityscape picture, if I were to remove the screaming noise, then what I would create there is probably what we might call a non-sequitur transition. Of course, comics is a monosensory medium. It relies on only one of the senses to convey a world of experience. It requires a visual looking at, okay? And I'm going to cut that there because the rest of this is actually taken from some more follow-through, but I'm not as concerned with that as much, but you can follow through looking at that. But what I really want to harp on and sort of mention here in particular, and returning to this idea of understanding comics with McCloud, is to keep in mind that we are dealing with something with a lot of complexity, and we're going to dig deeper into this complexity as we move forward. And I want you to sort of keep an open mind about it and remember that in this complexity, we're going to sort of try to figure out ways for us to approach comic books. And one of the things we're going to look at next week is we're going to actually look at a comic book paneling system of panels and depictions that have absolutely no words, because sometimes there are no words, and we're going to look at the idea of can we still get what the meaning is without the use of words. And as we move further along, we'll end up talking more and more about different types of relationships where there are situations where the words actually don't connect to the images are simply used to reinforce the words. These are things that have come out in a later chapter. All right, thank you.